However, if we look at how many people in the US participated in that clinical trial, that number is actually 40,000. So it's about 1 in 10,000 people. So when I asked that question, right, of how many of you know someone or have been yourself and have been in a clinical trial, I'm actually not surprised that no one has been in one, nor do they know of someone who has been in one. What we know is that clinical trial participants in general remain in a very niche group of the population. And what's even more concerning, however, is that within this very niche group, there's grave underrepresentation of racial diversity. So I want to slice the data a little bit further here. So we're still looking at the 2015 data. We can see that Black and African American participation in the clinical trials themselves remain a low percentage of participants. So in both cardiovascular disease as well as oncology, they represent less than 5% of that entire pool, even though they seem to have an adequate representation in psychiatry. And this indication has far fewer participants overall, however, compared to something like cardiovascular disease. And then I'm going to slice the data a little bit further down, and we look at women's participation in CVD trials. So this is, white women here are represented in blue, and they are the dominant race participating in these 5 selected trials. So a fibrillation, stroke, and embolism, right? Heart failure, deep vein thrombosis, and pulmonary embolism, pulmonary arterial hypertension, and heart attacks. And Asian women that are represented in red are the next represented race. And unfortunately, Black women comprise across the board less than 5% of the participants in these selected trials. So my specialty has been actually in oncology. And I want to show you a slice of kind of what's racially homogeneous throughout this lens here for oncology. And the same pattern really does hold across other indications, but I want to show you one particular type of indication. We're going to go into multiple myeloma, and we're going to see what the racial makeup looks like in that particular indication. So let's step back a little bit. Let's look at the oncology itself. So there was a ProPublica analysis that looked at oncology drugs that were approved between 2015 and 2018. And in total, there were 31 drugs approved during those years. And then they asked this really interesting question of who was at risk for each of those drugs that were approved, and who actually were the racial ethnic groups that were most represented in their trials. So you'll see in yellow here, right, whites were most at risk in 13 of the cases, and yet they represented as the largest group in 30 of the 31 drugs clinical trials. And even more concerning is that Blacks were at most at risk in 12 of those cancer drugs that were approved, and at equal relative risk as whites for additional 6 cases. But Blacks were not at all represented as a majority race. On average, only 4.1% of the patients in those trials were actually Black. And so the same analysis also found out that in 24 of the 31 cases, Blacks comprised less than 5% of the clinical trial participants. And as an aside, African Americans make up 13.4% of the US population. So this is oncology as a whole. Let's take a look at multiple myeloma. This is really interesting research coming out of the University of Kansas Center and published late last year in Lancet Hematology. They reviewed randomized clinical trials for multiple myeloma from 2005 to 2019. So it's a 15-year study here. And a review of clinical trials for multiple myeloma showed that the racial composition of the cohorts is frequently not reported, and that racial minorities are just consistently under-enrolled in these trials. So they looked at in total 100 randomized clinical trials, and only 26 actually reported the racial composition of their entire enrolled cohort, right? So it's not even just underrepresentation, it's not even reporting completely. And so of that, only 19 studies reported the number of Black participants enrolled. And so among these trials, only 730 of 12,915 patients were actually Black. And the dismal thing that we've been seeing is also this really great research is that they saw this over 15 years, right? So the percentage of racial minorities enrolled in these multiple myeloma clinical trials actually remained consistent across this 15-year study period. So the non-white participants made up about 14.7% of the trials between 2005 and 2009, A little increase here in 2010 to 2014 at 21.2%, but then back down again to 13.5% of trials between 2015 and 2019. And so what does this look like with regards to the drugs that were actually approved for multiple myeloma? So there are 4 drugs that we're looking at here: Darzalex, Implicity, Feridac, and Ninlaro. And when multiple myeloma has a life expectancy for about 3 to 5 years, depending on the stage of cancer. And additionally, 1 of 5 people diagnosed with multiple myeloma in the US is Black, and African Americans in general are more than twice as likely as white Americans to be diagnosed with multiple myeloma. And so when we look at the racial breakdown for these various different drugs, we see that there is underrepresentation, right, of Black and African Americans, ranging from about 1.8% to 10%, right? But that there are some drugs that had more homogeneous trial participants and others that had more diverse trial participants. So of note, Ninlaro, which was manufactured by Takeda, had a median progression-free survival of 6 months over standard of care. That is significant for cancer. And yet, of the 722 participants that were in Ninlaro's clinical trials, which was actually a global trial in US and 24 other countries, only 13 people, so 1.8% were Black. And so this doesn't bode well for a subgroup analysis to understand whether or not the drug would actually work for Black patients as well as it does for whites, even though this is a condition that afflicts Blacks more so than whites. And then we can contrast this, right? Even though it's still a shortcoming, we can take a look at this with the Black participation on Darzalex. So although it's not enough, this actually reached double digits at 10%. So we know that at least we can get better representation for clinical trials. And sponsor Johnson & Johnson has an internal working group on trial diversity. And so they seek minority physicians that also run trials to help patients be more comfortable with the clinical trial process. What we know here is that there's room to improve, and there is some real viable ways that we can improve our racial diversity. So I want to talk about kind of the reasons for low participation in racial ethnic minority groups in general. I want to caveat that this is a real multi-complex faceted problem that doesn't just encompass low enrollment, but that along the patient's clinical trial journey, there are many things that serve as barriers resulting in this ultimate low participation. So we're going to go through kind of 4 big kind of reasons. But again, just to let you know, there are many, many of them, and they actually tie up with one another. The first one involves mistrust in the community, especially around the Black community, from both a historical and also present day context with regards to how the scientific community has treated racial ethnic minority groups, which is really especially fraught in the Tuskegee, Alabama case here. So 600 Black men were enrolled without their consent in a 40-year syphilis study experiment by the Public Health Service, and that started in 1932. And even though the men, they received their free medical exams, they had free meals, and I think they even had burial insurance. Those that had the disease, though, however, were never informed or treated for it, right? Even after penicillin became an effective treatment. And you don't have to really go that far back. And also in 1990s, there were researchers at a prestigious US university that recruited African-American boys into a study that hypothesized genetic origin of aggressive behavior. And so they enrolled, they actually had the parents enroll their sons in a study, and they were given monetary incentives. And so this included the sons actually having to withdraw from all their existing medications, so including asthma medications. They were put on a low protein diet. They had to have an overnight stay without their parents. They withheld water. They had hourly blood draws, and they were given fenfluramine, which is a drug that's known to increase serotonin levels and suspected to be associated with aggressive behaviors. So, questionable ethical standards with regards to how clinical trials are practiced has really, fueled some of this mistrust within the community. Now, There's also this lack of awareness and or access. So again, like I said, this is a multifaceted problem. So even if people were still okay with the, or they didn't know about the mistrust issues, et cetera, there's a lot of other issues that prevent people from being completely aware about the presence of clinical trials. So in these situations, providers really play a crucial role as advisors that recommend enrolling minority patients into the clinical trials themselves. But studies have actually shown that they may be less likely to discuss possible trials with Black patients. There may be a lack of time, or even that the patient may not be appropriate for a clinical trial, or that a lack of comfort, that they may have a lack of comfort in discussing some of the informed consent that's needed given some of this historical context, right? Additionally, there's another point here I want to make about the fact that the providers of the minority groups themselves may work in hospitals where there may not be clinical trials, or there will be in smaller hospitals with fewer open clinical trials, and therefore there may not be as many opportunities to participate. And so this in and of itself actually could be a function of socioeconomic factors, right? As catchment areas for clinical trials may also be stratified based on socioeconomic geographic locations. This kind of brings me to the next point here, which is the fact that clinical trials is time and resource intensive. Participation is really socioeconomically skewed to those with financial stability. So if you think about it, participation in clinical trials means that patients have to travel often long distances. They need to take time off work or to find childcare to obtain the treatment, as well as to have check-ins, blood draws, et cetera, right? So additionally, while the candidate drug itself may be free for the patients, they actually may need to pay for the cost of the combination therapies, which again, if they're branded, they can be cost prohibitive. So example, back in multiple myeloma, Darzalex is actually approved in combination with another drug called Revlimid and dexamethasone. So dexamethasone, you've probably heard from COVID-19. It is an inexpensive steroid, but Revlimid is a branded drug that costs $16,000 a month, according to its list price. And this is unaffordable, right? Even for people with insurance who are then saddled with co-insurance payments. But it's totally out of the question for those who are underinsured or uninsured altogether. And a study about 5 years ago demonstrated that patients with an annual household income below $50,000 had a 32% lower odds of participating in a trial than a patient with income above that threshold. So that median household income of African Americans in 2016 was $39,000, and it's $47,000 for Hispanics. So that's below the $50,000 threshold compared to this of non-Hispanic white Americans, which is at $65,000 and over $80,000 for Asians. So you can see that the socioeconomic situation in and of itself contributes to this underrepresentation in clinical trials. The next one is the fact that the clinical trial design is restrictive. So they try to enroll what they call the healthiest participants. So the healthiest participants with only the ailment being tested, the healthiest of the sick, basically. And this is kind of to reduce the variable clinical trial outcomes. So the exclusion criteria on clinical trial protocols have become even more stringent. They exclude participants with comorbidities. So, and in case, or not in case, but in fact that patients of color are actually increasingly excluded as they are more often than white people, more often to have, comorbidities such as stroke, hypertension, and diabetes compared to whites. And so even when that happens, even when you don't have comorbidities and you can actually participate in the clinical trial, there's yet another barrier. When minority groups, meet this inclusion of the clinical trial protocols and they don't actually have any exclusion criteria, the actual protocol themselves may not be designed to fit within the lifestyle of minority communities. So, for example, some cultures may have morning rituals that prevent them from adhering to dosing requirements that are set aside in clinical trials. And so as we see here, there are barriers to participation increasingly become harder to overcome and in many stages across the patient's clinical trial journey, right? So it's not just about recruitment, it's about making sure that the clinical trial design is appropriate also for the patients that are going to be participating. And so wherever these gaps exist, right, they result in the misparticipation of these minority groups. And it's also a cost to the participants who may not otherwise obtain access to some of the world's most innovative medicines, which could also extend their lifespans and improve their quality of mind. So we've identified a ton of different problems as to the reasons why we have this issue, which again are complex and multifaceted, and the solutions to this will also be equally complex. They really require what we call a multi-stakeholder approach from various different stakeholders, so regulatory agencies to providers, patient advocacy groups, clinical research organizations, just to name a few. And again, I'm going to highlight just some of the important initiatives that have been going on before and even throughout COVID-19, which kind of brought much of this clinical trial diversity issues to the forefront of public attention. However, we've been talking about this, I think, in the scientific community for about, I would say, the past 5 to 10 years, and have been really making some really good progress, I would say, in the last 5 years. So let's take a look at what we've done. So I am highlighting 3 pharmaceutical companies here in terms of their efforts to increase diversity. And this is more than just diversity within clinical trials, because part of understanding that you want to enroll more diverse patients, sometimes what you have to do is work on the internal aspect of your organization, right? So you have to become aware of various different unconscious biases, et cetera. So there's a lot of workforce development within pharma currently that they're trying to work on in order for them to actually be aware of the things that they're currently not aware of. So I want to show you GSK. They have 3 core pillars, which is now committed to data quality, the first pillar, and they want to improve standardization of data collection that then will generate more useful patient insights and identify some product-specific information for them. They have a second pillar, which is patient engagement and insights, and that includes recruiting and engaging different patient populations they serve, and partnering with patient advocacy groups and networks to increase the participation of diverse patients. Their third pillar, again, is talking about more on their internal side, and that's to educate their own staff to achieve a diverse culture and competency. Janssen also has both an internal and external component to their strategy. So internally, they have Janssen ambassadors who can raise awareness and provide access to information regarding clinical trials in the communities that they serve. Janssen's also partnering with the Society for Clinical Research Sites to develop an awareness and best practice program for clinical trial sites to assist them in these diverse patient engagement in clinical research. Janssen's also focusing on increasing its access to therapies in low-income countries, and they are conducting trials where trials have not been routinely conducted, such as low and low-middle-income countries. Biogen is actually focusing heavily on investing its internal infrastructure itself. They've built a diversity and inclusion into its global strategy that's governed by its Diversity and Inclusion Strategic Council, and they're also looking into the future to building the next generation of STEM leaders by providing STEM access to low-income students. So again, like I said, this doesn't necessarily all directly impact patient, increasing the racial underrepresentation, but what we're doing is setting up for a good future here by which all these various different diversity issues can be addressed. All right, now that we've looked at some of the highlights for industry, the FDA actually is very important. This is the US governing body that manages the approval of new therapeutics and devices. And they've really taken a much more active role, especially in the past 5 years with regards to clinical trial diversity. Most recently, due to COVID-19, in November 2020, the FDA actually released its final guidance for industry to enhance diversity in clinical trials. And so the agency has updated its website to include patient-friendly information on clinical trial participation for minority groups. And then also for the past 5 years, the FDA has been releasing drug trial snapshots, which provides the general public about who participated in the clinical trials that then support the approval of new drugs. The FDA also has a directive to investigate how demographic subgroups fared in the clinical trials, and they make labeling changes based on the safety and the efficacy results in these subgroups. So an example I want to show you here is that Crestor, which is an LDL cholesterol lowering drug. The FDA has actually recommended that for Asians, they need to start at a lower dose because of pharmacokinetics evidence that show that Asians have a twofold increase in median exposure of the drug versus Caucasians. So this is only one of the examples. There are many, many examples where the FDA has actually restricted based on demographics, based on their subgroup analysis. Next, I want to talk about the NIH. So the NIH is working on a really interesting data collection effort of what's called observational trial participants. So they have this thing called the All of Us research program that launched nationally in May of 2018. They are trying to collect data from a diverse representative US population across a variety of health conditions. And they're focusing not just on race, but ethnicity, sex, gender, sexual orientation of everybody who lives in the United States. I think what's really uplifting about this is that in 2019, they looked at the number of participants that have signed up, I think around 350,000 participants. They have a goal, I believe, of at least 1 million. But then in 2019, the program had more than 80% of its participants are from the groups that have been historically underrepresented in biomedical research. So another good step in the right direction. We have also many diversity working groups. I want to highlight one here is the multi-regional clinical trials of the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. They are a diversity working group that is advancing the goals of diversity in clinical trials research. There are 50 individuals that represent academia, patients, patient advocates, regulatory authorities, clinical research organizations. This work group meets monthly by conference call and in small meetings, and they have basically put together 2 very, very informative guidance documents and a toolkit for people in industry, for people who are involved in clinical trial research. If you are involved in it, I would definitely highly recommend that you download these 2 things. They have some practical advice. They even have some strategy and some real pragmatic ways at which we can standardize data collection and increase patient and trial diversity. And finally, we have Pharma, which is a trade group. So I'm going to talk about the trade groups here that represent the country's leading innovative biopharmaceutical manufacturers. So Pharma themselves published their first guidance document on clinical trial diversity, of which these new principles are actually going to take effect in April of this year. Pharma president here has stated that critical to enhancing clinical trial diversity is addressing the systemic issues that deter mainly Black and Brown communities from participating in clinical trials so that those who want to participate can. And so they have 4 pillars that they have. The first one is building trust and acknowledging past wrongs. The companies are committed to enhancing diversity among clinical investigators. They're working with communities to educate the role of clinical trials and improve the community outreach so that those who want to participate can. And they'll also encourage the recruitment trial and investigators that they themselves come from diverse and racial and ethnic backgrounds, which will then act as trusted and knowledgeable sources of information. They want to reduce barriers to clinical trial access. So they want to do this. It's imperative for researchers to plan studies, right, and development programs that promote inclusion of diverse populations. So they want to implement protocols that define the intended treatment. This means actually involving people from Black and Brown communities who understand the populations and designing clinical trial protocols around that. And this also means working with the FDA to try to expand the clinical trial eligibility when it's appropriate, as long as it's still scientifically sound. Another thing that Pharma is doing is that they're trying to use real-world data to enhance information on diverse populations beyond product approval. So a lot of the stuff I've been talking about has been about regulatory submission to the FDA, but there's an entire group of clinical trials, what's called post-marketing approval, and they're trying to basically look at and make sure that we have clinical real-world data and evidence that can be important to supplementing the randomized clinical trial data that's usually used for submission. And so this data is super important because it is actually more reflective, right, of the general community that uses these various different drugs. And pharma's fourth pillar is enhancing information about diversity and inclusion in clinical trial participation. And again, this is about sharing best practices among pharma companies. So, having Biogen talk to Johnson & Johnson about what has worked for them, and understanding that, there are new principles and new standards and new best practices that we should all share. We should all be sharing all of our various different learning experiences. The next one is BIO. It's called Biology Innovation Organization, and they introduce what's called their bioequality agenda. So this encompasses more than just clinical trial diversity. Their 3 pillars are actually about planning to partner with contract research organizations and minority serving institutions, and planning to enable small biotechs that conduct trials to find clinical research organizations that have a track record of recruiting diverse trial participants. And so in terms of COVID-19, actually, BioMatch sponsored companies with various medical associations, National Medical Association, the National Urban League, and the National Association of Black Churches to help them find the patient population that can diversify participation in the COVID-19 trials. So I want to just kind of see, right, basically here are all of the various different initiatives that's been happening. And I want to see what has happened with regards to COVID-19. Well, COVID-19 itself kind of gave diversity another big boost. And here's kind of some of the highlights calling out for greater diversity of COVID-19 trials. This is really important here as the pandemic has taken a heavy disproportionate toll on people of color, especially Black adults. And almost everywhere you look, leading journals and pharma news sources are talking about and calling for COVID-19 clinical diversity and its implications in future research. So post-pandemic, we don't want to go back to how we were before. We want to take the opportunities and the lessons that we've learned to continue to work towards increasing this clinical trial diversity. So let's see what that progress has looked like in COVID-19. This is data from FDA's Drug Trial Snapshot Initiative, which, as you'll recall, is aimed to provide this accessible information regarding clinical trial design to the general public. So as part of the snapshot, they capture demographics data as well. And so for remdesivir, we see that there is better representation. So first of all, Blacks, which I think are in orange, Black or African American are in orange. They comprise 18% of the clinical trial participants, which is slightly higher than the national population percentage of Blacks in the United States. Now, again, there is still room for improvement, though, especially as this disease, again, disproportionately affects the Black and Hispanic population. Now, I haven't really talked about the Hispanic population, and this is the reason why, is because with remdesivir, we actually finally have data on Hispanic participation. And this is actually a rather new initiative from the FDA, as they actually did not make a guidance recommendation to record Hispanic participation until 2017. And so data for this ethnic group has been rather sparse, and why we haven't seen much data in general on Hispanic populations. Nonetheless, for remdesivir, Hispanics or Latinos comprise nearly a quarter of the clinical trial population. And so better representation, better data, right, than what we had before. And when we look at enrollment in each of the trials here, so this is looking at the remdesivir clinical trial. The green one is the Act 1 clinical trial, which comprised of hospitalized patients that had various different stages of disease, whereas the simple trial in yellow is talking about hospitalized severe patients. And so when we look at the percent of cases and hospitalizations versus the amount of enrollment, here we can see that it's a little bit better, right, with Blacks kind of being almost equal to what the percent cases of hospitalizations are. Hispanics also the same case. So we have seen some improvements there. And now let's take a look at the vaccine front here, right? So there is also improvement compared to other trials in the past. We have to first commend that both Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna did a much better job in recruiting diverse participants in their vaccine candidates than what it would have been likely in the past without this kind of prominent focus on diversity. Now, again, we still have, some ways to go, and given the fact that COVID-19 disproportionately affects racial and ethnic minority groups compared to whites, it's probably, these numbers should be higher than the simple representation of population. But again, this is still, a good step in the right direction. So with regards to Black recruitment, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna are about almost 10%. We finally have some data on American Indian and Alaska Native. And then also they captured Hispanic, as well as the Hispanic populations, as well as Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders. Okay, so as we come to kind of a close to this presentation, I want to leave you with this quote, which really encapsulates to me the importance of making sure that people can live in a much more just society, especially when we're discussing about matters of health, because negligence in doing so often means death for others. So this is a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that says, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and inhuman because it often results in physical death." So today we learned that issues revolving around racial underrepresentation in clinical trials has grave consequences for both the participant who's denied access to these innovative life-saving medicines, and it also robs the scientific world of the ability to understand how different races and ethnicities respond to these particular therapeutics. Will they require different dosing, more safety parameters, perhaps biomarker testing to determine whether or not they're suitable for a drug product? None of these questions are discoverable without adequate representation of the diverse participants that the drugs are intended for. So we've made quite a bit of progress since we started, but we still have a long ways to go. And the most important thing here is that we make continuous small steps every day to reach closer to adequate representation. So thanks for listening, everyone. I'm Hillary. You can go ahead and stop the recording, and I will go ahead and take some questions if anybody has some. I think